The pie was gone before Alara even turned around. She spun toward the open window, flour still on her hands, and caught the last flick of a gray tail disappearing over the sill. Her heart slammed once, hard, before her mind caught up with her body. A thief. Someone had come into her kitchen in broad daylight and stolen a pie straight off the cooling rack. She dropped her rolling pin on the counter and ran to the window, leaning out into the cool morning air. The forest behind her shop stood tall and silent, its dark trees swaying gently, giving away nothing. For a moment, she saw nothing at all. Then, low in the grass near the tree line, she caught sight of movement. 3 small shapes, low to the ground, fast and clumsy, tumbling over each other as they fled with her blueberry pie held awkwardly between them. Wolves. Pups, by the size of them, barely bigger than house cats, with oversized paws and ears too big for their heads, and they were running away with an entire pie balanced on top of one small back, wobbling dangerously with every stride. Alara should have been afraid. She had grown up hearing stories about the forest behind Hollow Pine, stories that kept most people from wandering too far past the tree line after dark. The land belonged to wolves, real wolves, the kind that walked sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4, ruled by a king no living person in her village had ever seen with their own eyes. Parents used his name to make children behave. Nobody spoke of him without lowering their voice first. But watching 3 pups struggle to carry a pie twice their own size, tripping over roots, yelping when the tin nearly rolled off the smallest one's back, Alara found herself laughing instead of screaming. It was such a strange, small, ordinary kind of chaos. Nothing about it felt like the danger the old stories promised. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out the back door, following the trail of scattered crumbs and small paw prints pressed into the soft dirt. She told herself she only wanted to see where they went. She told herself that twice, because the first time, she did not quite believe it. The pups did not go far. She found them just past the first line of trees, hidden behind a fallen log, tearing into the pie with more enthusiasm than skill. Purple filling covered their muzzles. One of them had somehow gotten the crust stuck to the top of its head like a strange little crown. They were making small, excited sounds, half growl and half something that sounded almost like laughter, and for a long moment, Alara simply stood and watched them, forgetting entirely that she was supposed to be angry. Then a twig snapped under her boot. All 3 pups froze. 6 wide eyes turned toward her at once, filling and crust dripping from small mouths, ears flattened low against skulls in sudden alarm. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Alara held up both hands, slow and open, the way she might if she had startled a nervous dog in the market square. "It is only me," she said softly. "I am not going to hurt you." The pups did not run. That surprised her more than anything else that morning. Wild animals ran. These 3 simply stared at her, trembling slightly, weighing her with an intelligence that did not belong in the eyes of ordinary wolves. The smallest one, the one with crust still balanced on its head, tilted its face and let out a small, uncertain whimper, as if it were asking her a question it did not have the words to speak. Alara crouched down slowly, keeping her hands visible, keeping her voice low and even.
"You made quite a mess of my pie,"
she said, glancing at the wreckage of crust and purple filling scattered across the leaves.
"Was it good, at least?"
The pups did not answer, of course. They only watched her, and for the first time she noticed how thin they were beneath their fur, ribs faintly visible along their sides, coats dull and matted in places. Whatever these 3 were, they had not eaten well in some time. That single detail settled something uneasy in her chest, some old and stubborn instinct that had nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with the kind of person she had always been. She had never been able to walk past a hungry creature without feeling the pull to help it, even when helping made no sense at all. She reached slowly into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small piece of bread she had tucked there earlier that morning, meant for the birds that gathered near her shop each day. She set it on the ground between them and drew her hand back, waiting. The smallest pup crept forward first, nose twitching, eyes darting between the bread and Alara's face. When nothing bad happened, it snatched the bread and retreated quickly to its siblings, and all 3 pups shared the small piece between them with surprising care, as if dividing it fairly mattered a great deal to them. Alara felt something shift inside her chest, something she could not name yet. She stayed crouched a while longer, saying nothing, simply letting them grow used to her presence. When she finally rose to leave, the 3 pups watched her go, and she could feel their eyes on her back the entire walk home. That night, she could not stop thinking about them. She told herself it was foolish. Wild animals stole food all the time, and there was nothing unusual about hungry young wolves finding an easy meal near a bakery. And yet she kept remembering the way they had shared that single piece of bread, the way they had looked at her, not with the blank wariness of an animal, but with something closer to careful, guarded hope. She woke before dawn the next morning, and, without quite deciding to, packed a small basket with day-old bread and a few broken pieces of pastry that had not sold. She left it near the fallen log at the tree line and returned to her shop to open for the day, telling herself firmly that she had only done it because good food should not go to waste. When she checked that evening, the basket was empty. For the next several days, this became her quiet routine. Bread in the morning, an empty basket by evening. She never saw the pups again during those first days, though sometimes she thought she caught the flick of movement between the trees when she came to collect the basket. Gone, the instant she looked directly at it. She began leaving slightly larger portions. She began arriving a little earlier each morning, lingering a little longer each evening, though she would not have admitted to herself exactly why. On the 5th morning, she found all 3 pups waiting for her at the edge of the trees before she had even set the basket down. They did not run this time. The smallest one, the one who had worn a crust like a crown, actually took a small step toward her before catching itself and freezing in place, clearly torn between fear and curiosity. Alara knelt down slowly, the way she had before, and set the basket between them, her heart beating fast with something that felt strangely like joy. "You are getting braver," she said softly. "That is good. The world is not always kind, but I would like to be, if you will let me." The pups exchanged a look between themselves, an oddly deliberate look, as though some silent conversation was passing between the 3 of them, that Alara could not follow. Then, one by one, they approached the basket, eating with far more care and manners than she had expected from wild creatures, taking turns, never snapping or fighting over the food the way she imagined true wolves might. It was strange, she thought. It was very strange indeed. But watching them eat peacefully in the pale morning light, their small bodies finally beginning to look a little less thin, Alara found she did not care how strange it was. She only cared that, for the first time and longer than she could remember, something in this quiet corner of the world needed her, and she intended to be there for it. She had no way of knowing, kneeling there in the cool morning grass with 3 wolf pups eating from her basket, that she had just taken the first step into a story far larger and far stranger than any pie could ever explain, one that would eventually bring the most powerful and most feared creature in the entire forest walking straight through her front door. But that morning, watching 3 small pups slowly begin to trust her, she only knew one simple thing. Whatever these 3 were, wherever they had come from, and whatever had left them so hungry and so alone, she was not going to turn her back on them now. The days that followed felt different, brighter somehow, though nothing about her life had truly changed. She still rose before dawn to light her ovens. She still kneaded dough until her arms ached and sold pies to the same familiar faces in the village square. But now there was a small secret woven through her mornings and evenings, a quiet thread of purpose that made even the hardest chores feel lighter. She began to notice small things about the pups that unsettled her the more she thought about them. The way they sometimes seemed to listen to her voice, as though they understood every word, tilting their heads at exactly the right moments, as if following the meaning, rather than simply the tone. The way their eyes, when the morning light caught them just right, seemed almost too knowing, too aware, for creatures so young and so small. Ordinary wolves did not behave this way. She was certain of that much, even though she had never met one before these 3 arrived in her life. One morning, as she set the basket down, the smallest pup did something that made her breath catch entirely. Instead of eating immediately, it looked up at her, opened its small mouth, and made a sound that was not quite a bark and not quite a word, but somewhere uncomfortably close to both. It almost sounded like it was trying to say something. Alara stayed very still, staring down at the pup, her mind racing through every old story she had ever half listened to as a child, stories she had always dismissed as nothing more than superstition, meant to keep foolish villagers away from the forest. Stories of creatures that were not entirely wolf and not entirely human, bound somewhere in between, hidden deep in these very woods, under the rule of a king few had ever seen, and fewer still had ever survived meeting. She had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, the kind of tales told around a fire to make an ordinary forest feel more exciting than it truly was. Now, kneeling in the damp morning grass with 3 pups in front of her, one of them clearly trying and failing to speak, she was no longer so certain those stories had been exaggerated at all. And somewhere deep in the trees behind them, far beyond where her eyes could reach, something far larger than any pup was beginning to stir, drawn slowly by whispers passing quietly through the forest of 3 lost young ones, and the strange, gentle human woman who had chosen, again and again, to feed them. A low growl rolled out from the trees, and Alara's blood went cold. It was not one of the pups. She knew that instantly, the same way a person knows the difference between a candle flame and a wildfire. This sound was deeper, older, carrying a weight that made the small hairs on her arms rise, before her mind had even finished processing what she was hearing. She had been kneeling in the grass with the basket of bread, the 3 pups gathered close around her feet, when the sound rolled out of the shadows like distant thunder. The pups reacted first. All 3 froze mid-bite, ears snapping upright, small bodies going rigid with a fear so sudden and so complete that Alara felt it pass into her own chest like a physical blow. Then, without any warning at all, they scattered, vanishing into the underbrush so quickly that she barely saw them go. Alara rose slowly to her feet, scanning the tree line, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw nothing. The forest looked exactly as it always did, dark and quiet and still, the morning mist curling low between the trunks. But she could feel eyes on her, somewhere in that stillness, watching with a patience that unsettled her far more than the growl itself had. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting how small and thin her voice sounded against the silence pressing in around her. Nothing answered. After a long moment, the feeling of being watched slowly faded, and the ordinary sounds of the forest returned, birds calling, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. Alara stood there a while longer, unwilling to move until she was certain the danger had truly passed. When she finally did leave, she walked backward for the first few steps, unable to shake the sense that something large and unseen was tracking her retreat. She did not sleep well that night. Every creak of her small house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against her window sounded like breathing. She told herself repeatedly that she had imagined the intensity of the moment, that fear had simply made an ordinary forest sound worse than it truly was. But some quiet, honest part of her knew better. Whatever had growled at her that morning had been real, and it had been close. Despite her fear, she returned the next morning with the basket, because leaving 3 hungry pups without food over something she could not even fully explain felt unthinkable to her. She moved more carefully this time, watching the shadows, listening for any hint of that same deep growl. The pups were waiting again at the tree line, thinner with worry than with hunger now, watching her approach with visible relief. "I am glad you are safe," she whispered, setting the basket down. "I was worried about you last night." The pups ate quickly, glancing often toward the deeper woods, and Alara understood without being told that whatever had growled the previous morning had frightened them just as badly as it had frightened her. She wondered, not for the first time, exactly what kind of world these 3 small creatures belonged to, and exactly what kind of danger might be circling them even now. Over the following days, she noticed the pups becoming more careful, more secretive, always glancing over their shoulders, even while eating, always ready to bolt at the smallest unexpected sound. Alara began to feel a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness rising in her chest each time she watched them flinch at shadows. Whatever they were running from, she decided, she was not simply going to feed them and walk away. She wanted to understand. One quiet afternoon, when business at her shop was slow, she finally allowed herself to ask around the village, carefully, without revealing too much about why she wanted to know. She spoke with old Mr. Callum, who ran the tannery near the edge of town, and who was known for remembering every story ever told about the forest, whether true or not. "Wolves that walk like people, and people that turn to wolves," he said, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of dried meat as he spoke. "My grandfather always said the forest belonged to them long before it belonged to us. Said their king was fair, but only if you never crossed him. Said there was trouble in the pack some years back, a betrayal of some kind. though nobody outside the woods ever learned the full truth of it. Trouble, Ilara repeated carefully. What kind of trouble? Mr. Callum shrugged his heavy shoulders. The kind that scatters families, from what little I heard. Some say the king lost kin he never found again. Might be old gossip. Might be nothing at all. Wolves keep their business to themselves, and wise folk keep out of it. Ilara thanked him, and walked home slowly, turning his words over carefully in her mind. Scattered families, lost kin never found again. It fit together with uncomfortable precision. 3 young pups alone, and starving at the edge of human land, flinching at every unfamiliar sound, watched over by something powerful enough to make even brave men speak carefully. That night, she made a decision. She would keep helping the pups, whatever the risk, because turning away from them now felt like a betrayal of something important inside herself. But she would also be more careful, more watchful, aware now that whatever unseen presence guarded these woods might not appreciate a human woman, growing so close to creatures it clearly still considered its own. The next several mornings passed quietly, without any further sign of the growling presence, and slowly Ilara's fear began to ease into something more manageable, though never fully disappearing. The pups grew bolder with each visit, allowing her closer, sometimes even brushing against her hand briefly, before darting back, as though testing exactly how much trust they were willing to risk. She began to give them names, quietly, without ever saying them aloud, in case doing so somehow made the pups feel owned, rather than cared for. The smallest one, always first to approach and first to retreat, she privately called Wren, for the small, quick birds that darted through her garden each spring. The middle pup, steady and watchful, always positioning itself slightly ahead of the other 2 as though standing guard, she called Finn. The largest of the 3, quiet and thoughtful, often sitting a little apart and observing everything with careful golden eyes, she called Milo. She never spoke these names near them at first, worried it might frighten them somehow, but one morning, without thinking, she murmured, "Good morning, Wren," as the smallest pup approached the basket. The pup froze instantly, ears perking with unmistakable recognition, and let out a small excited sound that could only be described as delight. From that morning onward, she used their names freely, and each pup responded to its own name, with a clarity that left no doubt in her mind. These were not ordinary wolves. They understood far more than any wild animal reasonably should. As days turned into weeks, the pups began following her closer to the edge of her property, though they never once crossed fully into the open yard behind her shop. It was as though some invisible boundary held them back, some rule they dared not break even in their growing comfort with her. Ilara respected that boundary without understanding it, continuing to meet them at the same familiar spot each morning and evening, watching with quiet joy as their coats grew glossy and full, their thin frames filling out with healthy weight, their eyes growing brighter with each passing day. But even as her bond with the 3 pups deepened, that same uneasy feeling of being watched never entirely left her. Some mornings she caught the faintest impression of movement deep within the trees, gone the instant she turned to look directly at it. Some evenings, the low growl returned, distant but unmistakable, always enough to send the pups scattering instantly into hiding until it passed. Ilara began to suspect that whatever powerful presence ruled this forest was aware of her now, watching her every visit with careful and deliberate patience, waiting perhaps to see exactly what she intended toward the 3 young ones she had so quietly taken under her care. She did not know it yet, but her patience, her quiet daily kindness, and her growing fondness for 3 lost pups had already begun to draw the attention of someone whose name alone was enough to silence an entire village, someone who had been searching relentlessly for exactly what Ilara had unknowingly found first. Ilara nearly dropped the basket when she saw the blood. It was early, earlier than her usual visit, the sky still holding on to the last gray shades of dawn. She had woken suddenly from a restless sleep with an odd, urgent feeling pulling her out of bed, a feeling she could not explain, but could not ignore either. When she reached the tree line, she found Milo lying on his side in the damp grass, a shallow wound cut along his back leg, dark red staining his pale fur. "Milo," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside him without a second thought for her own safety. Wren and Finn stood close by, pacing anxiously, letting out small, distressed sounds that tugged painfully at her chest. Milo whimpered as she gently examined the wound, and to her relief she saw quickly that it looked worse than it truly was. a shallow scrape rather than anything life-threatening, though it clearly pained him. She had nothing with her, no cloth, no water, nothing but her own apron, and without hesitating she tore a strip from the hem and pressed it carefully against the cut. "What happened to you?" she murmured, more to herself than to him, though something in his eyes made her feel, not for the first time, that he understood the question perfectly well, and simply had no way to answer it. She glanced nervously toward the deeper trees, wondering if whatever had hurt him was still nearby, wondering if the low growl she had heard so many times before belonged to whatever had caused this injury. The forest remained silent, offering no answers. "I need to clean this properly," she said, thinking quickly. "Can you walk, if I help you?" Milo struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg heavily, and to her surprise, he did not resist when she carefully gathered him into her arms. He was heavier than she expected, warm and trembling slightly, but he did not fight her, resting his head against her shoulder as though he trusted her completely, with something as important as his own safety. Ren and Finn followed close behind, pausing constantly at the very edge of the tree line, torn between fear of the open yard and worry for their brother. "Come on," Elara said gently, glancing back at them. "Just this once. I promise you will be safe." It took a long moment, but eventually both pups crept forward, crossing the invisible boundary they had never dared cross before, following her all the way to the back door of her shop. Elara felt a strange, quiet triumph in that moment, small as it was, knowing how much trust it must have taken for them to follow her into unfamiliar territory. Inside, she laid Milo carefully on a folded blanket near the warm hearth, and set to work cleaning his wound with warm water and a gentle hand, murmuring softly the entire time, the same calm, steady tone she used when soothing frightened customers or nervous children in her shop. Ren and Finn stayed pressed close to their brother's side, watching Elara's every movement with careful, unblinking attention. As she worked, something extraordinary happened. Milo's body began to shimmer faintly, the edges of his fur blurring softly, like heat rising from summer stone. Elara froze, her hand still resting gently on his leg, and watched in stunned silence as his small wolf shape slowly folded and shifted, bones and fur rearranging themselves with impossible grace, until where a wolf pup had been lying only moments before, there now lay a small boy, no older than perhaps 6 or 7 years, dark-haired, pale with pain, a matching scrape marking his leg in human form exactly where the wound had been on his wolf form. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She sat perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment entirely. The boy opened his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and fear. "Please," he whispered, his voice small and cracked from disuse, "don't be afraid of us." "I am not afraid," Elara said quickly, though her heart was pounding fiercely in her chest. She kept her voice as gentle and steady as she could manage. "I promise you, Milo, I am not afraid." Beside him, Ren and Finn shifted as well, their small wolf forms blurring and reshaping into 2 more children, a girl with wild curling hair who could only be Ren, and a boy slightly taller and sturdier who was clearly Finn. All 3 children stared at her, with matching expressions of cautious hope, as though her reaction in this single moment would decide everything that followed. "You understood us this whole time," Elara said softly, looking between the 3 of them. "Every word." Ren nodded slowly. "We could not speak like this before. Not safely. Not until we knew you would not hurt us, or tell others what we are." "I would never hurt you," Elara said firmly. "And I would never tell anyone something that could put you in danger." "You have my word." Finn studied her carefully, the way a much older person might, weighing the sincerity behind her promise. "Our kind does not give trust easily to your kind," he said quietly. "But you fed us when we had nothing. You never once tried to trap us, or hunt us, even though you must have known what stories are told about wolves like us." "I heard the stories," Elara admitted. "But stories are not always true, and even when they are, they rarely tell the whole picture. I only saw 3 hungry children who needed help. That was enough for me." Milo, still resting against the blanket, managed a small, tired smile. "You are kind," he said simply. "Kinder than most of the humans in the old stories our mother used to tell us." Something in the way he said the word mother made Elara's chest tighten painfully. "Where is your mother now?" she asked gently, already fearing the answer. The children exchanged a heavy, sorrowful glance between themselves, and for a long moment none of them answered. Finally Ren spoke, her small voice trembling. She is gone. There was trouble in our pack, trouble none of us fully understand, and we were separated from everyone during the chaos. We have been alone in these woods ever since, hiding, trying to stay safe, trying to find our way home. And your father? Elara asked carefully. Is there no one searching for you? At this question, all three children stiffened visibly, an odd mixture of hope and fear crossing their young faces at once. Our father is the king, Milo said quietly, almost too quietly to hear. If he still lives, he will be searching. He would never simply let us stay lost. But it has been so long, and the woods are so vast, and we have been so careful to hide our scent and our tracks from everyone, including him.
Elara sat back slightly, absorbing the weight of what she had just learned.
These were not simply lost shifter children. These were the missing heirs of the very Alpha King, whose name alone could silence an entire village. Children whose disappearance had likely shaken an entire kingdom, hidden within these ancient woods. Why would you hide from your own father? She asked gently. Finn answered this time, his young voice carrying an old, careful wisdom. Because we do not know for certain who caused the trouble that separated us. Until we know it is truly safe, we cannot risk revealing ourselves to anyone, not even to him, not until we understand who among our own pack might still wish us harm. The weight of their fear settled heavily over the small, warm room, and Elara found herself reaching out instinctively to gently squeeze Milo's hand where it rested atop the blanket. Then you will stay hidden here, for as long as you need, she said firmly. I will help you however I can, and I will keep your secret exactly as carefully as you have kept it yourselves. The three children looked at her with something that went far beyond simple gratitude, something closer to the fragile, desperate hope of children who had spent far too long believing they were entirely alone in the world. Outside, the sun had begun to rise fully over the treetops, spilling warm golden light through the small kitchen window, and for the first time since this strange and impossible morning had begun, Elara allowed herself to feel something like quiet hope as well. She did not yet know how deeply her life was about to change, or how soon the powerful and mysterious Alpha King would finally track his missing children to her very doorstep. But sitting there in her warm kitchen, surrounded by three frightened yet remarkably brave children who had chosen, against every instinct of caution, to finally trust her completely, she knew without any doubt at all that she would face whatever came next, standing firmly and fearlessly by their side. A stranger's boots crushed the grass just outside her window, and every candle in the kitchen seemed to dim at once. Elara froze mid-motion, a clean cloth still pressed against Milo's bandaged leg, her eyes darting toward the small window above her sink. Outside, the morning light had shifted subtly, clouded by something that felt less like weather and more like intention. The three children went rigid beside her, their earlier warmth and openness replaced instantly by a sharp, silent alertness that reminded her uncomfortably of prey sensing a predator nearby. Someone is here, Ren whispered, barely moving her lips. Do you know who? Elara asked quietly, already moving to block the children from direct view of the window. Finn shook his head slowly, his young face pale with tension. I do not recognize the scent. It could be Pack. It could be someone hunting for us with far worse intentions. Elara's mind raced. She had no weapon in her small kitchen beyond kitchen knives, no experience whatsoever in facing anything remotely dangerous, and three vulnerable children depending entirely on her judgment in this single terrifying moment. She drew a steadying breath, forcing her voice to remain calm. Stay low, stay quiet, and stay behind me, she instructed firmly. No matter what happens, do not shift back into your wolf forms, unless I tell you to. Understood? All three children nodded, pressing themselves instinctively closer together near the warmth of the hearth. Elara moved carefully toward her front door, peering through the narrow gap beside the frame, her pulse hammering loudly in her own ears. A tall figure stood at the edge of her small garden, cloaked heavily despite the mild morning weather, face shadowed beneath a deep hood. The stranger moved with unnatural stillness, head tilted slightly, as though listening intently for something beyond ordinary human hearing. Elara's stomach twisted uneasily, Whoever this was, they were clearly not an ordinary traveler passing innocently through Hollow Pine. She opened the door only slightly, enough to speak without revealing anything of the room behind her. "Can I help you with something?" she called out, proud of how steady her voice managed to sound despite her racing heart. The stranger's head turned slowly toward her, and though she could not see clearly beneath the hood, she felt the full weight of an intense, searching gaze settle upon her. "I am looking for something that may have wandered onto your property," the stranger said, voice low and carefully controlled. "Small creatures, wolves, though not entirely ordinary ones. Have you seen anything unusual in these woods recently?" Ilara's heart nearly stopped, though she forced her expression to remain politely puzzled. "This is a bakery," she said evenly. "I see squirrels stealing bread crusts most mornings, if that is any help to you." The stranger studied her a moment longer, and Ilara had the deeply uncomfortable sensation of being carefully measured, weighed, and found only partially convincing. "If you do happen to see anything unusual," the stranger said finally, "it would be wise to report it immediately, rather than involve yourself further. These are not creatures a human woman should attempt to protect. Whatever kindness you imagine yourself offering could very easily become a danger to your own life." "I will certainly keep that in mind," Ilara replied, matching the stranger's careful, measured tone exactly. The stranger lingered a moment longer, before finally turning and disappearing back into the tree line, with unsettling speed, moving in a manner far too smooth and controlled to belong to any ordinary human traveler. Ilara closed the door quickly, sliding the small bolt into place with trembling hands, though she knew perfectly well that an ordinary wooden bolt would offer no real protection against whatever that stranger truly was. "That was not our father," Finn said quietly from behind her, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "How do you know?" Ilara asked, turning back toward the children. "Because our father would never have needed to ask," Milo answered grimly. "He would already know. He would recognize our scent from a mile away, no matter how carefully we tried to hide it." Ilara felt a fresh wave of cold fear settle over her. Then who was that? The three children exchanged another one of their silent, meaningful glances. "Someone searching for us with a different purpose," Ren said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who wants to find us before our father does." The weight of this realization pressed heavily down upon the small kitchen. Ilara understood now, with sudden painful clarity, exactly how dangerous this situation truly was. These children were not simply lost. They were being hunted, and whoever was hunting them clearly had reason to fear the Alpha King discovering his own children safe and well. "We need to be more careful," Ilara said firmly, kneeling down to meet the children's frightened eyes directly. "From now on, you cannot wander near the tree line during daylight hours. If you need to come to me, you come only after dark, and only when you are certain no one has followed you. Do you understand?" The children nodded solemnly, and from that day forward, their careful daily routine shifted into something far more secretive and far more dangerous. Ilara began leaving her back door slightly ajar each night, allowing the children to slip quietly inside under cover of darkness, spending precious hours together before they returned cautiously to the shelter of the deep woods, before dawn light could reveal their tracks. During these quiet nighttime hours, Ilara learned a great deal more about the children and the world they came from. She learned that Milo, despite being the largest and quietest of the three, carried the heaviest emotional burden, having witnessed firsthand the chaos and violence of the night their pack was torn apart. She learned that Ren, despite her small size, possessed a fierce protective instinct toward her siblings that reminded Ilara powerfully of her own protective feelings toward all three of them. And she learned that Finn, though only a child, carried himself with a careful, calculating wisdom that suggested he had already begun to understand far more about pack politics and danger than any child ever should. She also learned, slowly and carefully, more about their father, the Alpha King. The children clearly both feared disappointing and desperately longed to see again. They spoke of him with a complicated mixture of pride and worry, describing a powerful, fair, but deeply private ruler who had grown increasingly guarded and distant since the loss of their mother years before their own disappearance. They worried, quietly and painfully, that their continued absence might be breaking something already fragile within him. "Do you think he still searches for us?" Ren asked one evening, curled beside the warm hearth with a blanket wrapped snugly around her small shoulders. I am certain of it, Elara said firmly, without any hesitation at all. No father capable of loving his children, the way you describe, would ever simply stop searching. I imagine he has never stopped, not for a single day. The children seemed comforted by her certainty, though Elara herself privately worried about exactly what would happen when that inevitable search finally led the powerful Alpha King directly to her own small doorstep. She had no idea what kind of reception to expect from a ruler feared throughout the entire region, a ruler who might view her involvement with his missing children as either an act of kindness deserving gratitude, or an unforgivable interference deserving severe punishment. Despite this quiet, persistent worry, Elara found herself growing more deeply attached to the three children with every passing night. She taught them simple human customs during their secret visits, sharing warm meals, teaching small games, listening patiently as they slowly opened up about the family and home they had lost. In turn, the children taught her small things about their own hidden world, careful fragments of pack tradition and shifter history that no ordinary human had likely ever been trusted to learn. Yet even as this fragile, precious bond deepened between them, the mysterious stranger's warning continued echoing uncomfortably in the back of Elara's mind. Someone dangerous was actively searching for these children, someone with reason to fear their safe return to their father's protection. And though the days passed quietly enough on the surface, Elara could not shake the growing certainty that danger was drawing steadily closer, patient and unseen, waiting only for the right moment to strike. The back door burst open before Elara could even reach it, and Finn tumbled inside with blood on his hands. Not his own blood, she realized quickly, scrambling up from her chair as panic surged through her chest. Finn's eyes were wide with terror, his small chest heaving with exhausted breaths, his human form trembling violently in the doorway. They found us, he gasped out. The hooded one, the one from before. He found our hiding place. Ren and Milo are still out there. Elara did not hesitate for even a single second. She grabbed her cloak from its hook and pulled Finn gently, but urgently by the shoulder. Show me where, she said firmly, her voice far steadier than she actually felt. They ran together through the darkened trees, Finn leading the way, with the sure, instinctive speed of a creature born to these woods, despite his human form. Elara struggling to keep pace behind him, branches catching at her cloak and hair. Somewhere ahead, she could hear frightened yelping, sharp and desperate, and her heart clenched painfully at the sound. They burst into a small clearing to find Ren and Milo, both still in their smaller wolf forms, cornered against a wall of thick brambles by the same tall, hooded figure from before. The stranger's cloak had fallen back slightly in the struggle, revealing sharp, inhuman eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness, and Elara understood instantly, and with total certainty, that this was no ordinary human hunter. This was another shifter, powerful and dangerous, moving with a predatory grace that made her blood run cold. Stop! Elara shouted, before she could think better of inserting herself directly into such obvious danger. The stranger's head snapped toward her voice, clearly startled by her sudden arrival. This does not concern you, human, the stranger snarled, voice far harsher now than it had been during their first careful conversation. Step away, and you will not be harmed. They are children, Elara said fiercely, positioning herself firmly between the stranger and the two frightened pups, her entire body shaking with fear, even as she refused to move. Whatever quarrel you have, it does not belong anywhere near them. The stranger's eyes narrowed dangerously. You do not understand what is at stake here. Those children carry royal blood. As long as they remain missing, certain arrangements within the pack remain stable. Their return would upset a balance that has taken years to carefully build. Elara's mind raced, piecing together the terrible implication behind those careful words. Someone within the pack itself had orchestrated the children's disappearance, someone who benefited directly from the Alpha King's continued grief and distraction, someone determined to ensure these children never found their way home again. You would hurt innocent children simply to protect your own position? Elara demanded, disgust hardening her voice despite her fear. I would do far worse than that, the stranger replied coldly, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. And you, foolish woman, have just made yourself a serious complication I did not anticipate having to deal with. Behind her, Finn had shifted quickly back into his smaller wolf form, moving protectively to stand alongside his siblings, all three pups bearing small teeth despite their obvious fear, refusing to abandon the human woman who had come running without hesitation, directly into danger for their sake. Alara had no weapon, no training, and no realistic way to physically defend three shifter children against a fully grown, dangerous opponent. But she had something else entirely, a fierce and stubborn refusal to simply stand aside and allow harm to come to children she had come to love, as fiercely as if they were her own. "If you want to reach them," she said, voice trembling but resolute, "you will have to go through me first." The stranger studied her for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the complications of harming an ordinary human woman against the urgency of silencing three vital witnesses. Just as the stranger took another threatening step forward, a sound erupted through the forest that stopped everyone completely still, a deep, powerful howl that rolled through the trees like a physical force, carrying an authority that needed no translation. The hooded stranger's confident posture shattered instantly into visible panic. "Impossible," the stranger hissed, eyes darting frantically toward the source of the sound. He should not be anywhere near this territory tonight. Alara felt her own heart leap with a confusing mixture of terror and desperate hope. She did not need to be told exactly who that powerful howl belonged to. Every instinct in her body understood immediately that the Alpha King himself was somewhere close, drawn perhaps by his own children's distress, closing in rapidly upon this very clearing. The stranger hesitated only a moment longer before turning sharply and fleeing into the darkness, moving with the same unnatural speed that had brought them here in the first place, disappearing swiftly among the shadowed trees, before Alara could even fully process the sudden reversal of danger. She sank immediately to her knees, pulling all three pups tightly against her chest, her entire body shaking with the aftermath of pure terror finally beginning to release its grip. "You are safe," she whispered fiercely, over and over, more to convince herself than them. "You are safe now, all of you." The pups pressed close against her, trembling nearly as badly as she was, and for several long minutes none of them moved, simply absorbing the shock of how close disaster had truly come. Finally, Ren shifted quietly back into her human form, tears streaking silently down her small face. "He is close," Ren whispered, "our father. I could feel it in that howl. He has never sounded like that before, not even when we were small and safe at home." "What did it mean?" Alara asked gently, still holding all three children close. Milo, also shifting back to human form now, answered quietly. "It means he is furious and frightened, and closer to finding us than he has ever been before. That howl was not simply a call. It was a warning to anyone foolish enough to threaten what belongs to him." Alara felt a fresh wave of nervous uncertainty rise within her chest, mixing uncomfortably with her lingering relief. If the powerful Alpha King truly was as close as his children believed, then the moment she had quietly worried about and prepared herself for since that very first stolen pie was rapidly approaching, whether she felt fully ready to face it or not. "We should return to the shop," she said finally, helping the children carefully to their feet. "It is not safe to remain out here any longer tonight, not with that stranger still somewhere nearby." The walk back through the dark woods felt different now, charged with a new and urgent tension that had not existed before that terrifying encounter. Alara kept all three children close beside her, her senses straining anxiously for any further sign of danger, though the forest remained eerily silent for the remainder of their journey. Once safely back inside her small kitchen, she quickly bolted the door and checked every window twice, though she understood perfectly well that such simple precautions would offer little real protection against creatures capable of the speed and power she had just witnessed firsthand. She built up the fire, wrapped the children in warm blankets, and sat with them quietly through the remaining hours of darkness, her mind turning over everything that had just happened, everything the dangerous stranger had revealed about a hidden conspiracy within the very heart of the pack itself. Somewhere out in those vast, dark woods, the most powerful creature in the entire region was drawing steadily closer, driven by a fury and desperation that Alara could only imagine. And though she felt genuine fear at the thought of finally coming face to face with the legendary Alpha King, she also felt something else entirely, a quiet, steady resolve settling firmly into place within her chest. Whatever happened next, whatever judgment the king might choose to pass upon her for her involvement with his missing children, She would stand firmly beside Ren, Finn, and Milo, exactly as she had promised from that very first frightened, hopeful morning. She had already decided, somewhere deep within herself, that she was not going to let fear of an unknown king undo the fragile, precious trust she had worked so hard and so carefully to build with 3 children who desperately needed someone brave enough to fight for them. Morning light had barely touched the windowsill when Milo suddenly gasped and clutched at his chest, as though something invisible had struck him hard. Alara rushed to his side immediately, alarmed by the sudden change in his expression. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Milo shook his head slowly, though his eyes remained wide, with a strange, unreadable emotion. "It is not pain," he said quietly. "It is something else. A pull. I have never felt anything like it before." Ren and Finn exchanged a startled glance, before both of them suddenly seemed to feel the same strange sensation, pressing their hands unconsciously against their chests, as though something deep within them had shifted overnight. "What does it mean?" Alara asked, glancing worriedly between the 3 children. "It means our bond with our father is growing stronger," Finn explained slowly, clearly working through the realization himself, even as he spoke it aloud. "The closer he comes, the more strongly we feel it. It has been so long since we felt this connection so clearly. We assumed something had broken it permanently. Then he truly is close," Alara said, her stomach tightening with a fresh wave of nervous anticipation. "Closer than he has ever been since we lost him," Ren confirmed softly. The 3 children fell into a thoughtful, heavy silence, and Alara could see clearly the internal struggle playing out across their young faces. After everything they had endured, after months of careful hiding and fear, the possibility of finally reuniting with their father now stood tantalizingly close. Yet that same possibility remained tangled uncomfortably with lingering uncertainty about the danger still surrounding them. "We cannot keep hiding from him," Milo said finally, his voice firm despite its youthful tone. "Not after last night. Whoever that stranger was, they nearly succeeded in silencing us permanently. If our own father does not know we are alive and searching for us, we remain vulnerable to whoever within the pack still wishes us harm. But if we approach him, and it turns out the traitor has already reached him first, poisoned his trust somehow," Ren argued nervously, "we could be walking directly into far greater danger than the one we already faced last night." Alara listened carefully to this careful, painful debate between the 3 siblings, understanding perfectly well the impossible weight of the decision resting upon such young shoulders. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "I think," she said slowly, "that hiding has already nearly cost you everything once. I do not believe hiding any longer will keep you safer. If your father is truly as fair and as loving as you have described him to me, then I believe reaching out to him directly, carefully and cautiously, remains your safest path forward." "How would we even manage that safely?" Finn asked. "We cannot simply walk into pack territory and announce ourselves without any protection, not with a traitor clearly still watching for exactly that opportunity." Alara considered this carefully for a long moment, before an idea began forming slowly in her mind. "What if he did not have to find you in pack territory at all?" she said finally. "What if instead, we found a way to draw him here, to my shop, somewhere with walls around you, somewhere I could stand beside you the entire time?" The children stared at her, with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "You would be willing to have the Alpha King himself come directly to your home?" Milo asked, clearly startled by the boldness of her suggestion. "I already have 3 of his children living quietly under my roof," Alara pointed out with a small, wry smile. "I think inviting their father to join them is simply the natural next step." Despite the tension still hanging heavily in the room, this small joke managed to coax a tired but genuine laugh from all 3 children, breaking some of the anxious pressure that had built steadily since the previous night's terrifying encounter. "But how would we even manage to draw him here?" Ren asked, sobering quickly. "We have spent so long hiding our scent and our tracks, specifically to avoid detection." "Perhaps," Finn said slowly, an idea visibly forming behind his thoughtful eyes. "It is time we stopped hiding those tracks entirely, at least carefully and selectively. If we allow him to sense us, just enough to draw him toward this location, without exposing ourselves to anyone else who might also be watching, we could control exactly how and where this reunion finally happens." The three siblings discussed this plan carefully throughout the remainder of the morning, working out precise details with a level of strategic thinking that continually impressed and unsettled Ilara in equal measure. She realized, watching them work together so seriously, that these were not merely lost children waiting passively to be rescued. They were young shifters, raised within a world of careful pack politics and calculated danger, forced by circumstance to grow far more capable and resourceful than any child should ever need to become. By afternoon, they had settled upon a plan. That evening, under cover of darkness, Finn and Milo would venture just far enough beyond Ilara's property to allow their scent to travel clearly upon the wind, carefully timed and controlled, before immediately retreating back to the safety of the shop. If their father truly remained as closely attuned to their presence as the strange pulling sensation from that morning suggested, he would surely notice and follow the trail directly toward them. And if the traitor notices it first? Ilara asked carefully, unwilling to ignore the very real danger such a plan still carried. Then we will already be safely back inside these walls, Milo said firmly, and this time, we will not be caught alone and unprepared. Ilara nodded slowly, though a persistent knot of worry remained lodged firmly in her chest throughout the remainder of that long, tense day. She busied herself with familiar work, baking bread and pies for her shop, as though the day were entirely ordinary, though her mind remained constantly occupied with worry for the dangerous plan awaiting nightfall. As evening finally settled over Hollow Pine, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Ilara gathered all three children close one final time before they prepared to carry out their careful plan. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, holding each of their gazes steadily in turn, "please remember that you are not facing this alone. I am right here, and I intend to remain right here, no matter what comes through that door before morning." The children each nodded solemnly, and though fear remained clearly visible behind their young eyes, something else had grown steadily alongside that fear over the past difficult months. A quiet, stubborn courage born from finally having someone unwavering and steady, standing firmly by their side. As darkness fully claimed the forest outside, Finn and Milo slipped quietly out into the night, moving carefully along the very edge of Ilara's property, exactly as planned, while Ren remained close beside Ilara, inside the warm, watchful safety of the small kitchen. The minutes stretched agonizingly slowly, each one weighed down by unbearable tension, until finally, far off in the darkness, a low and powerful howl rose once again through the trees, closer now than it had ever sounded before, carrying within it something that sounded unmistakably like recognition. Ilara felt Ren go rigid beside her, tears welling instantly in the young girl's eyes. "He heard them," Ren whispered, voice trembling with an overwhelming mixture of terror and desperate hope. "He is coming." Ilara reached out and took Ren's small hand firmly within her own, drawing a slow, steadying breath as she prepared herself for whatever powerful and unpredictable force was now moving swiftly and directly toward her small, humble bakery under the cover of darkness. Every torch in the great hall snuffed out at once when King Cassian rose from his throne. It was not magic, not exactly, though few within his pack would have argued the difference. It was simply the weight of his fury and grief pressing down upon the very air around him, a weight that had grown heavier with each passing month since his three children vanished without a trace. Tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that same weight had shifted suddenly into something sharper, something that felt dangerously close to hope. He had felt it clearly, unmistakably, a faint but undeniable pull along the bond he shared with his own children, a connection he had feared permanently severed after so many months of agonizing silence. It came from the direction of Hollow Pine, the small human village bordering the southern edge of his territory, a place he had personally searched twice before without success. "Your Majesty," his second in command, a broad and steady wolf named Alistair, said cautiously as Cassian moved swiftly toward the great doors, "should we gather a full search party before venturing out?" "There is no time," Cassian growled, already shifting partially into his powerful hybrid form as he moved, muscles rippling beneath skin and fur simultaneously. "I felt them, Alistair, all three, together, alive. I will not risk losing that trail waiting for anyone." Alistair fell into step beside him regardless, matching his king's urgent pace, despite clear concern, etched across his weathered face. "Then at least allow me to accompany you. If this truly is your children, After everything they may have endured, they will need more than simply your presence alone. Cassian did not argue further, understanding the wisdom in his loyal friend's words even through the overwhelming urgency clouding his thoughts. Together, they moved swiftly through the ancient forest, tracking the faint trail of his children's scent with a focus so absolute that nothing else in the entire world seemed to exist beyond that single desperate purpose. As he ran, memories he had spent months trying desperately to suppress rose unbidden to the surface of his mind. He remembered clearly the chaotic night his children vanished, a night that had begun as an ordinary pack gathering before dissolving suddenly into confusion and violence when an unknown attacker struck without warning, scattering pack members in every direction. He remembered searching frantically through smoke and darkness for his 3 children, only to find their scent trail ending abruptly at the forest's edge, as though they had simply vanished into thin air. He remembered the crushing weight of failure that followed, the months of fruitless searching, the slow and painful realization that he might never see his children again, and the way that grief had gradually hardened into a cold, distant fury that had transformed him steadily, from a warm and approachable ruler, into someone even his closest advisors now approached with visible caution. He had lost his beloved mate years earlier to illness, and losing his children as well in such violent, unexplained circumstances had very nearly broken something essential within him. Only the smallest, most stubborn ember of hope had kept him searching relentlessly through every long, difficult month since, refusing absolutely to accept that his children were truly gone forever. Now, running swiftly through familiar moonlit trees with that same fragile hope burning brighter than it had in months, Cassian allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to imagine what it might feel like to finally hold his children safely in his arms once again. As they drew closer to the edge of Hollow Pine, Cassian slowed his pace slightly, his sharp senses cataloging every detail of the surrounding forest with careful, practiced precision. The scent trail grew steadily stronger, unmistakably belonging to his 3 missing children, mixed curiously with the warm, unfamiliar scent of baked bread and something else entirely, something gentle and distinctly human. "There is a human scent mixed throughout this trail," Alistair observed cautiously, clearly noticing the same detail. "Recent and consistent. Whoever this human is, they have had extensive contact with your children." Cassian's jaw tightened at this revelation, a complicated mixture of gratitude and protective suspicion rising sharply within his chest. If a human had somehow been caring for his lost children during their months of hiding, he owed that person an enormous debt of gratitude. But if that same human had somehow been involved in concealing his children from him for reasons less innocent, his fury would know absolutely no limits. They continued forward cautiously, the trail leading directly toward a small, unassuming bakery shop situated at the very edge of the village, its windows glowing warmly with soft candlelight despite the late hour. Cassian felt his children's presence pulsing strongly now from somewhere within that small building, a certainty so absolute that his entire body trembled slightly with barely restrained emotion. "Your Majesty," Alistair said quietly, placing a cautious hand upon his king's arm, "however you find them, however this human has treated them, I urge you to remember that your children have clearly survived months of danger and hardship. Whatever anger or fear you carry, they will need calm reassurance from you now, not fury." Cassian drew a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his racing heart and roiling emotions into some semblance of controlled calm, though the effort cost him more than he cared to admit even to his oldest and most trusted friend. "I understand," he said finally, voice rough with barely restrained emotion. "But make no mistake, Alistair. If anyone within that building has caused my children harm, controlled calm will not save them from my judgment." Together, they approached the small bakery slowly, moving with careful, deliberate silence, despite Cassian's overwhelming urge to simply tear the door from its hinges and rush inside immediately. As they drew close enough to make out details through the softly glowing window, Cassian caught his first clear glimpse in months of something that made his powerful legs nearly buckle beneath him entirely. Through the window, he could see clearly 3 small, familiar shapes gathered close around a warm hearth, alive and healthy, and unmistakably his own children, seated beside a young human woman who was gently tending a fire, with a warmth and familiarity that spoke of far more than simple recent acquaintance. For a long suspended moment, Cassian simply stood frozen outside that small window, drinking in the impossible, overwhelming sight of his children, safe and whole, after so many agonizing months of uncertainty and fear. Then, without any further hesitation, he moved swiftly and purposefully toward the small wooden door, his powerful presence radiating outward with an intensity that seemed to press physically against the very walls of the humble little bakery. Inside, Elara felt the change in the air an instant before she heard anything at all, a sudden, overwhelming pressure settling heavily throughout the small room, as though the very atmosphere itself had grown thick with barely contained power. All three children went rigid beside her simultaneously, their eyes widening with a shock of emotion so profound that words utterly failed to capture it. "He is here," Ren whispered, voice trembling violently. "He is really, truly here." Elara rose slowly to her feet, her heart pounding fiercely, as she turned toward the front door, just as it swung open, revealing the tall, powerful, and unmistakably commanding figure of the Alpha King himself, standing framed within the doorway, his sharp golden eyes sweeping the room with an intensity that stole the very breath from her lungs. For one terrible frozen heartbeat, nobody in the small warm kitchen moved at all. King Cassian filled the doorway completely, his broad shoulders nearly brushing the frame on either side, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that made the very air feel charged and dangerous. His hybrid form remained only partially shifted, powerful muscles visible beneath skin that had not yet fully returned to its human shape, claws still faintly visible at the tips of his fingers. Every instinct screamed at Elara that she was standing before something far more powerful and far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered in her entire life. Then his gaze fell fully upon his three children, and something in his fierce expression cracked wide open entirely. "Ren, Finn, Milo," he breathed, their names falling from his lips like a prayer he had repeated silently every single day since losing them. He took a single trembling step forward, and Elara felt the overwhelming emotion radiating from him fill the entire small room. But instead of running forward into their father's outstretched arms, all three children reacted in a way that clearly stunned him completely. They shrank backward instantly, moving with swift, unified instinct directly behind Elara, gathering close against the back of her simple dress, small hands gripping tightly at the worn fabric, as though it alone could shield them from whatever danger their traumatized minds still associated with sudden, powerful, unfamiliar figures appearing without warning. Cassian froze mid-step, his outstretched hand falling slowly back to his side, raw hurt and confusion flashing openly across his powerful features. He said again, softer this time, clearly struggling to understand why his own children, the very children he had searched for so desperately across countless sleepless months, were hiding fearfully behind a human stranger rather than running joyfully toward him. "Papa," Ren whispered from behind Elara's skirts, her voice small and uncertain. "Is it truly you? We have been fooled once before by someone pretending kindness. We had to be certain." Cassian's expression softened instantly and completely, understanding flooding through his powerful frame as painful realization settled heavily upon him. "Of course," he said gently, forcing every trace of his earlier fierce intensity to soften into something far more careful and reassuring. "Of course you had to be certain. I am sorry. Take whatever time you need." He slowly lowered himself down onto one knee, bringing his imposing height down to something far less threatening, and carefully allowed his partial shift to recede entirely, his powerful form gradually softening back into something more fully human, more familiar, less overwhelming. Elara felt the tension in the small hands still clutching her dress ease only slightly, though the children remained firmly positioned behind her, clearly still working through months of accumulated fear and caution, before fully trusting even their own father again. "It really is me," Cassian said softly, his voice thick with barely restrained emotion. "I have searched for you every single day since that terrible night. I never once stopped believing I would find you again." Slowly, cautiously, Milo peered out from behind Elara's shoulder, studying his father's face with careful, searching intensity. "You look tired," he said quietly, an observation that seemed to cost him considerable effort to voice aloud. "I have been very tired," Cassian admitted honestly, a small, pained smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Losing you three very nearly broke something inside me that I feared could never be repaired." This simple, honest admission seemed to finally crack through the last of the children's careful defenses. Milo stepped forward first, moving slowly, but steadily, away from Alara's protective shadow, followed quickly by Finn, and finally by Ren, until all three children stood facing their father directly, tears now flowing freely down each of their young faces. "We missed you so much," Finn said, voice breaking completely on the final word. Cassian opened his arms wide, and all three children rushed forward at once, colliding into his embrace, with such force that he nearly toppled backward entirely, though he simply gathered them close instead, wrapping his powerful arms tightly around all three of them simultaneously, burying his face against the top of their heads, as deep, racking sobs of pure relief shook through his entire powerful frame. Alara stood quietly to the side, watching this overwhelming reunion, with tears of her own sliding silently down her cheeks, feeling simultaneously joyful for the children she had come to love so deeply, and strangely uncertain about her own place within this suddenly transformed situation. After several long, emotional minutes, Cassian finally lifted his head, his golden eyes still bright with unshed tears, and turned his attention fully toward Alara for the very first time since entering the small kitchen. His expression shifted rapidly through several complex emotions at once: gratitude, curiosity, and something else far more difficult to name. "You are the one who has been caring for them," he said, his deep voice carrying a careful, measured tone that Alara could not immediately read. "I am," she confirmed, straightening her spine slightly, despite her lingering nervousness, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his powerful, searching gaze. "My name is Alara. I found them stealing a pie from my kitchen window several weeks ago, and I simply could not bring myself to turn hungry children away, no matter what unusual form they happened to be wearing at the time." A flicker of surprised amusement crossed Cassian's features briefly, quickly replaced once again by intense, focused seriousness. "They have told you what they are then. What we are." "They have," Alara confirmed steadily. "And it changed nothing about how I felt toward them. They needed help. I was simply glad to be able to offer it." Cassian studied her carefully for a long silent moment, his sharp gaze seeming to weigh and measure every word she spoke, with careful, deliberate attention. "Do you understand," he said slowly, "exactly how much danger you placed yourself in, sheltering shifter children without any true understanding of the politics and dangers surrounding them?" Before Alara could respond, Milo spoke up quickly from where he remained tucked securely against his father's side. "She protected us, Papa. Last night, someone attacked us in the forest, someone hunting specifically for us, and Alara came running, without any hesitation at all, to stand between us and danger, even though she had no weapon, and no way to truly defend herself." Cassian's entire body went rigid instantly, his gaze snapping sharply back toward Alara with fresh intensity. "Someone attacked you," he repeated, voice suddenly dangerously low. "Tell me everything, immediately." Alara recounted the terrifying encounter as clearly and calmly as she could manage, describing the hooded stranger's chilling words about pack politics and deliberate betrayal, watching as Cassian's expression darkened steadily with each word, his powerful hands curling slowly into tight, controlled fists. "A traitor within my own pack," he said grimly once she finished, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "I suspected something of this nature during the initial investigation, but I could never uncover solid proof. This changes everything." "Do you know who it might be?" Alara asked carefully. Cassian's jaw tightened visibly. "I have my suspicions. Suspicions I intend to investigate thoroughly, and swiftly, now that I understand the true scope of the danger my children have faced." He turned back toward Ren, Finn, and Milo, his expression softening once again as he studied each of their faces carefully. "None of you will be returning to pack territory until I have resolved this threat completely and permanently. Do you understand?" The children nodded solemnly, though Ren spoke up hesitantly after a moment's pause. "Where will we stay then, Papa? We cannot remain hidden in the forest indefinitely, not with someone actively hunting for us." Cassian's gaze shifted thoughtfully back toward Alara, and she felt her heart skip uncertainly beneath the sudden weight of his careful consideration. "That," he said slowly, "depends entirely upon whether Alara would be willing to continue extending the same remarkable kindness she has already shown my children, at least until this matter can be fully and safely resolved. Elara blinked in surprise, glancing quickly toward the three hopeful faces of Ren, Finn, and Milo, before returning her attention to their powerful, watchful father. "Of course," she said without any hesitation at all. "I told them from the very beginning that I would help however I could, for as long as they needed it. That promise has not changed simply because their father has finally arrived." Something shifted subtly in Cassian's expression at these words, his earlier careful wariness softening gradually into something warmer, something that looked remarkably like genuine, deepening respect. "Then it seems," he said quietly, "that my family and I owe you a debt of gratitude far greater than I initially understood upon walking through that door tonight." "You owe me nothing," Elara said firmly. "I did what any decent person would do, faced with three hungry, frightened children in need of help." Cassian studied her for a long, thoughtful moment, something complicated and difficult to name, flickering behind his intense golden eyes. "Perhaps," he said finally, his deep voice carrying an unexpected note of quiet warmth, "but not every person, faced with such circumstances, would have shown the same courage and unwavering kindness you have demonstrated so consistently these past several weeks. That is not nothing, Elara. That is something remarkably rare indeed." Outside, the night remained dark and quiet around the small bakery, but inside its warm walls, something profound and unexpected had begun quietly taking shape. A fragile, hopeful new beginning, built upon danger survived, trust carefully earned, and the unbreakable bond between three lost children and the brave, kind-hearted woman who had refused, from that very first stolen pie onward, to ever turn her back on them. A single dark feather, caught deliberately beneath the hooded stranger's cloak that night, finally revealed the traitor's true identity. Cassian had returned briefly to Pack territory the following morning, leaving Alistair behind at Elara's bakery to help watch over his children, while he personally investigated the scene of the previous night's attack. Among the trampled undergrowth and scattered signs of struggle, he discovered the small, distinctive black feather, marked with a faint silver pattern unique to only one particular lineage within his entire pack. He recognized that pattern instantly, and the recognition settled over him like ice water poured directly down his spine. Counselor Draven. It made a terrible, painful kind of sense the moment Cassian allowed himself to truly consider it. Draven had served as one of his most trusted advisors for years, a clever and ambitious wolf who had grown increasingly vocal in recent months about the pack's need for stronger, more decisive leadership during Cassian's prolonged grief following his children's disappearance. Draven possessed distant royal blood himself, a claim to succession that would only become relevant should Cassian's direct heirs remain permanently lost or unaccounted for. Cassian returned immediately to his private chambers, his mind racing furiously as he pieced together months of subtle manipulation he had been too consumed by grief to properly notice at the time. Draven's constant suggestions that the search for his children was consuming resources better spent elsewhere. Draven's careful cultivation of allies among pack members, increasingly frustrated by their king's prolonged emotional distance. Draven's suspiciously convenient absence during several key search efforts over the preceding months. He summoned Alistair back immediately through their private mental bond, and within the hour his loyal friend had returned to pack territory, expression grim upon learning of Cassian's discovery. "I always found something slightly unsettling about him," Alistair admitted quietly, "though I never once suspected he might be capable of something this severe. Ambition can transform even trusted friends into dangerous enemies," Cassian said grimly, "especially when that ambition remains carefully hidden behind years of apparent loyalty." Together, they moved swiftly and carefully to confront Draven directly, gathering sufficient additional evidence along the way to ensure their confrontation could not be easily dismissed or deflected. They found him within his private quarters, calmly reviewing documents, as though entirely unaware of the danger rapidly closing in around him. "Your Majesty," Draven said smoothly upon their entrance, rising immediately with practiced deference, "this is an unexpected visit. Is there some urgent pack matter requiring my counsel?" "You could say that," Cassian replied evenly, though barely restrained fury simmered dangerously beneath his controlled exterior. He produced the small black feather, marked distinctly with Draven's unique family pattern, and set it deliberately upon the table between them. "This was discovered at the scene of an attack against my children last night." For just a fraction of a second, something flickered dangerously behind Draven's carefully composed expression, before smoothing over once again into practiced innocence. "I cannot imagine how such a thing could have found its way to any such location," he said carefully. "Perhaps it was planted deliberately to mislead your investigation." "Perhaps," Cassian said coldly, "though it seems a remarkable coincidence that this supposed deception happens to align perfectly with several other troubling patterns I have only just begun properly examining. Your consistent discouragement of continued search efforts, your convenient absences during critical moments, your growing influence among pack members increasingly questioning my continued fitness to rule." Draven's composed mask finally began cracking visibly under the weight of Cassian's steady, unrelenting accusations. "You have no true proof of anything beyond baseless suspicion," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier smooth confidence. "I have enough proof to warrant a full and thorough investigation," Cassian replied firmly, "an investigation that will proceed regardless of your continued denials. If you are truly innocent of these accusations, you have nothing whatsoever to fear from such an inquiry." Draven's eyes darted briefly toward the door, and Cassian felt Alistair shift subtly beside him, ready to intercept any attempted escape. After a long, tense moment of visible internal struggle, something within Draven finally seemed to break entirely. "You were never fit to lead us properly after losing your mate," Draven spat suddenly, all pretense of innocence abandoned completely. "Your grief made you weak, distracted, utterly incapable of the decisive leadership our pack desperately required. I merely accelerated what circumstances had already begun. Removing your children from the equation simply ensured that weakness would not be perpetuated indefinitely through inadequate heirs raised by a broken, grieving father." Cassian felt cold fury settle deep within his chest at this chilling admission, though he forced himself to maintain rigid control rather than allowing pure rage to overtake careful judgment. "You endangered innocent children," he said quietly, voice trembling only slightly with the effort of restraint. "My children, simply to further your own ambitions for power." "I did what was necessary for the future stability of this pack," Draven replied, chin raised defiantly, despite his now fully exposed guilt. "You would have done the same, faced with a leader you believed incapable of protecting this territory properly." "I would never harm innocent children to achieve any goal, regardless of how important I believed that goal to be," Cassian said firmly. "That single fact alone proves definitively that you were never fit to lead this pack, Draven, whatever weaknesses you imagined existed within me." Alistair moved forward at Cassian's subtle signal, quickly restraining Draven before he could attempt any desperate escape, while Cassian summoned additional trusted guards to formally place the disgraced counselor under proper custody, pending full judgment before the pack's traditional council. As guards led Draven away, still muttering bitter justifications for his actions, Cassian felt a profound wave of relief wash through his entire body, knowing finally, and with absolute certainty, that the danger threatening his children had been fully identified and permanently neutralized. He returned to Alara's bakery later that same evening, his expression carrying visible signs of the emotional toll such a difficult confrontation had demanded, though also carrying an unmistakable lightness that had been entirely absent during his earlier arrival the previous night. "It is done," he told Alara and his children simply, once he had settled comfortably within the warm, familiar kitchen. "The one responsible for your disappearance and for last night's attack has been identified and taken into custody. You are all finally, truly safe." The relief that flooded through the small kitchen at this announcement was palpable, all three children visibly relaxing for what felt like the first time in months, their earlier constant wariness finally beginning to ease into something resembling genuine, lasting peace. Over the following days, as arrangements were carefully made for the children's eventual safe return to pack territory, Cassian found himself returning to Alara's small bakery with increasing frequency, ostensibly to continue overseeing his children's well-being during this careful transition period, though he began to privately acknowledge to himself that his visits carried motivations extending well beyond simple parental concern. He found himself drawn repeatedly to Alara's quiet strength, her unwavering kindness, and the remarkable courage she had displayed so consistently throughout an ordeal that would have overwhelmed most ordinary humans entirely. He watched her interact patiently and lovingly with his children, teaching them small human customs, listening carefully to their fears and hopes, offering steady comfort during difficult emotional moments as they slowly processed months of trauma and uncertainty. "You have given them something precious," he told her quietly one evening, as they sat together, watching the children playing a simple game near the warm hearth. "Something I fear I could not have provided them during those difficult months, consumed as I was by my own grief and desperate search." "You searched for them every single day," Alara said gently. "That matters more than you seem willing to give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," Cassian admitted, "but searching alone does not heal frightened hearts, the way patient kindness clearly has. Whatever comes next for my family, Alara, I want you to understand fully how deeply grateful I remain for everything you have done, and continue to do, for my children." Alara felt her cheeks warm slightly beneath the weight of his sincere, steady gaze, an unfamiliar flutter of something she was not quite ready to name yet stirring gently within her chest. "They are remarkable children," she said softly. "I have simply been glad to know them, and glad to help however I could along the way." Cassian studied her carefully for a long, thoughtful moment, something warm and complicated flickering steadily behind his intense golden eyes. "I find myself hoping," he said slowly, carefully choosing each word, "that our acquaintance need not end, simply because the immediate danger has finally passed." Alara met his steady gaze directly, her heart beating a little faster beneath his careful, meaningful words. "I would like that very much," she said honestly, surprising herself slightly with the easy certainty behind her own answer. Something shifted quietly and warmly between them, in that simple, honest exchange, a fragile new possibility, taking careful root alongside the deep, protective bond already firmly established between Alara and his 3 beloved children. Neither of them spoke further of it that particular evening, content instead to simply enjoy the warm, peaceful atmosphere of the small kitchen, 3 happy children playing nearby, danger finally behind them, and something hopeful and entirely new quietly beginning to take shape between a humble village baker and the powerful king who had finally found his way home. 3 months later, Alara stood at the edge of the very same tree line where a small, thin pup had once stolen a pie right from beneath her nose, and she could hardly believe how completely her life had transformed since that ordinary, unremarkable morning. The bakery behind her still stood exactly as it always had, warm and familiar, filled each morning with the comforting scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries. But everything surrounding that small, steady constant had shifted dramatically. Ren, Finn, and Milo had safely returned to pack territory weeks earlier, formally welcomed home by an entire pack that had mourned their absence deeply and celebrated their safe return with genuine, overwhelming joy. Draven's betrayal had been fully judged before the pack council, and swift, appropriate consequences had been carried out, restoring a measure of stability and trust that had been dangerously fractured during his hidden manipulations. Cassian's visits to Hollow Pine had continued steadily throughout those months, growing gradually more frequent, and the careful, hopeful connection that had first sparked quietly between them had deepened steadily into something neither of them any longer felt any need to deny or downplay. He had told her honestly, during one particularly memorable evening walk through the very same woods where they first properly met, that meeting her had reminded him powerfully of qualities he had feared permanently lost within himself following his mate's death: warmth, hope, and the capacity to trust openly and completely once again. Today marked a particularly special occasion. Cassian had requested, with visible nervousness quite unusual for someone normally so composed and commanding, that Alara accompany him and his children on a visit to the pack's main territory, someplace she had not yet formally visited despite months of deepening involvement in their lives. As she followed the familiar trail deeper into the ancient forest, 3 excited young voices called out joyfully from somewhere ahead. Ren, Finn, and Milo came bounding toward her at once, healthy and vibrant, their coats gleaming beautifully now with proper care and nourishment, all traces of their earlier thin, frightened appearance completely gone. "You came," Ren exclaimed happily, shifting quickly into human form to embrace Alara warmly. "Papa said you might be too busy with the bakery today." "I would never miss a chance to see all of you," Alara said warmly, hugging each child in turn, as Finn and Milo also shifted to greet her properly. Cassian emerged from the trees a moment later, his powerful presence still carrying that same commanding intensity, though softened now considerably, by the warm, genuine smile that spread easily across his features upon seeing her. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, drawing close enough that his voice carried only for her. "There is something important I would like to show you, if you are willing." Curious and a little nervous, Ilara nodded, allowing Cassian and his 3 excited children to lead her further into territory she had never before been permitted to see. They eventually emerged into a beautiful, expansive clearing at the heart of the ancient forest, where an entire gathered pack stood waiting, watching with visible curiosity and warmth as their king approached alongside the human woman who had saved his beloved children. "Everyone here already knows what you did for us," Cassian explained quietly as they walked forward together. "Word travels quickly throughout a pack this close-knit, especially concerning news this important. They have been eager to properly thank you themselves." Ilara felt a flush of nervous surprise as an elderly pack member stepped forward first, bowing respectfully. "You have our eternal gratitude," the elder said warmly, "for protecting our future king and queens when they needed protection most desperately." One by one, pack members approached to offer their own heartfelt thanks, and Ilara found herself deeply moved by the genuine warmth and acceptance radiating from an entire community she had feared might view her human presence with suspicion or hostility instead. Once the gathering had settled, Cassian guided her gently toward the very center of the clearing, where Ren, Finn, and Milo stood waiting together, matching excited smiles lighting up all 3 young faces. "Ilara," Cassian said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the quiet clearing, "these past months have taught me something I feared I might never experience again after losing my beloved mate. You have shown my children, and honestly shown me as well, that kindness and courage remain powerful enough to overcome even the deepest grief and fear. You have already become an irreplaceable part of this family in every way that truly matters." He knelt down slowly before her, and Ilara's breath caught sharply in her throat as she realized exactly what was happening. "I am asking you," Cassian continued, his golden eyes bright with open, vulnerable emotion, "whether you would be willing to formally join this family and this pack, not simply as a beloved friend, but as my mate and as these 3 wonderful children's mother, in every sense that matters." Ren, Finn, and Milo watched with barely contained excitement, clearly having been let in on this important surprise beforehand, their hopeful expressions mirroring exactly the emotion swelling powerfully within Ilara's own chest. "Yes," she said immediately, tears of pure joy spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, absolutely yes." The clearing erupted immediately into joyful celebration, pack members howling and cheering enthusiastically, as Cassian rose swiftly to gather Ilara into a warm, powerful embrace, quickly joined by 3 overjoyed children, wrapping their arms tightly around both of them at once. In the months that followed, Ilara divided her time carefully between her beloved bakery in Hollow Pine and her new life within the pack, gradually teaching interested pack members her cherished baking recipes, while learning in turn about the rich traditions and history of the family and community she had so unexpectedly become a permanent part of. Ren, Finn, and Milo thrived under the combined loving care of both their father and their new mother, their earlier trauma slowly healing into distant, manageable memory rather than a constant, painful burden. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Ilara would catch herself standing at her old familiar bakery window, remembering clearly that very first morning, when 3 small hungry pups had stolen a single pie directly from beneath her nose. She would smile warmly at the memory, marveling at how such a small, simple act of instinctive kindness had ultimately transformed her entire life so completely and so beautifully. She often told the story to curious villagers who noticed the powerful, protective man who now frequently visited her shop, and the 3 lively children who called her mother with such open, easy affection. She always ended the story the same simple way, smiling warmly at whoever happened to be listening. "I only wanted to feed some hungry creatures who needed help," she would say. "I never once expected that simple kindness would lead me directly to the family I never even knew I was missing." And every single time she told that story, she meant those words completely and entirely, grateful beyond measure for the single stolen pie that had quietly, unexpectedly, changed absolutely everything.